Our Old Testament reading this morning is from Genesis 37. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing this flock?" The man said, "They have gone away, for I've heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to him, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum, balm, and rosin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Does the hustle and bustle of life keep you trapped in a dark pit of stress? Or maybe your finances are unstable and you've fallen in a deep hole of debt and despair. What are the pits that imprison you? In November of 2009, I preached the Joseph story for the very first time in Seymour, Texas. And I used those words to address a crowd of at least 10 or 11 people and exactly one dog. That's a true story. And what I preached isn't untrue. God does want to deliver us from the pits in our life. But Joseph's problem wasn't his finances. It was the prejudice of his brothers. You see, many of us Western preachers, and I am guilty, we have a real problem preaching texts like these. One preacher might teach about David and Goliath and then ask, "What are the giants in your life?" And then go on to talk about pornography and addictions and career choices and life decisions. But David didn't face an addiction that day. He encountered an actual flesh and blood human being that required a physical response. Another might preach that Jesus calmed the storm and then ask, what are the storms in your life? And the preacher then discusses job loss, unexpected illness, or psychological anguish. Yet the storm Jesus calmed was not job loss or illness. The storm was a weather pattern that physically threatened human life. Speaking as if life is only a matter of handling interior concerns or soul concerns leaves us uninformed and naive regarding large swaths of reality. And Joseph's story doesn't simply ask us what pits we find ourselves in. It asks us to walk into the tension of generational violence, dysfunction, and brokenness. It asks us, what does it mean to live in a world where the people who should be our allies are instead the threat? And what can one family system afflicted with inequality and violence teach us today? And unfortunately, the trouble in the Joseph story doesn't begin in our text today. As you see, Joseph's great-grandparents, Abraham and Sarah, had a tumultuous relationship. 2 separate times, Abraham pawned Sarah off as his sister to another man to protect his own life. When they were unable to have children, Sarah gives her handmaid Hagar to Abraham to conceive a child, an act that was not illegal, but was dehumanizing to Hagar, whose consent is at best taken for granted, and at worst, completely unimportant. Hagar has a child named Ishmael, and Sarah eventually has a child named Isaac. And while watching the 2 brothers play together one day, Sarah asks Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. And this will not be the last time that prejudice and favoritism break apart this family. Isaac grows up and marries Rebekah, and they give birth to 2 boys, Esau and Jacob. Esau, a hunter and an outdoorsman, is favored by his father, while the more domestic Jacob is his mother's favorite. Together, Jacob and his mother devise a scheme to trick their sick dad into blessing Jacob instead of Esau. And the scheme works. And Esau, who has now lost both his birthright and his blessing to Jacob, is furious. Esau makes a solemn vow to murder his brother just as soon as dad passes away. Mom hears about the vow and sends Jacob away. Second time, prejudice, superiority break open this family. Jacob eventually gets his comeuppance when he is tricked into marrying not just Rachel, the sister he loved, but also her older sister Leah. We presume that he's so drunk on his wedding night that the wrong sister is snuck into the room and seals the marriage. How would you like to be the wrong sister? And what burdens might the children of this wrong sister carry? And Leah's consent is again not even considered in the story. But she begins having babies, and Rachel is jealous, a common symptom in this family for generations now. And Rachel gives her handmaid to Jacob to conceive children since she's thus far been unable to. Leah sees this and does the same, and Jacob has 10 children with Leah and the handmaids before his true love, Rachel, ever begins to have children. But she does. And the first child is Joseph. Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, loves Joseph more than all the others. And where did Jacob learn to play favorites? From his father and mother. And where did they learn it? From their father and mother. Prejudice and favoritism or superiority are passed down in this system from generation to generation. And they nourish and feed the pent-up anger and violence that's been building in this family for at least 2 generations now, until it finally explodes onto Joseph. Joseph's brothers plot to murder him, and they would have if 2 of the older brothers, Reuben and Judah, hadn't intervened. But Judah talks them into selling Joseph into slavery instead. So let's resist the urge to make heroes out of them. This is one messed up family. And that's an understatement. Yet this biased, broken, and violent family is the one God uses to carry hope and blessing to the nations. And what qualifies them for such a role? Absolutely nothing. And that may be the entire point. Their family is a complete wreck, and that does not a single thing to impede the God of grace and mercy. Nothing. In 2009, after I preached my sermon in Seymour, a woman in the congregation who we'll call Judy wanted to share with me what the Joseph story meant to her. So she invited me to lunch afterward, and she told me her story. Judy's father was an alcoholic. She was the youngest child and the only daughter, and she too was her father's favorite, but for all the wrong reasons. And her brothers were violent, and they made her early years miserable. But she had a neighbor, a woman in her 70s who had walked past Judy's shack every Sunday morning on her way to church in this small Texas town. And she started picking Judy up and taking her with her. Even though Judy didn't believe in God, she loved coming to church. She felt safe there. No one teased her for the rags she wore as clothes. The men were kind to her without wanting anything from her. The women gave her bows and ribbons for her hair, and occasionally they even gave her hand-sewn dresses. But most importantly, there was a potluck every single Sunday after church, where she could eat all of the macaroni, fried chicken, and banana pudding her tiny stomach could handle. If there was a heaven, Judy thought, this must be what it is like. And somewhere along the way, she heard the Joseph story. Joseph was also his father's favorite, and it didn't do anything but cause him trouble also. His brothers hurt him too. Joseph is sold into slavery, works as a servant for a while, and then gets thrown in prison when Potiphar's wife tries to rape him. And Judy related far too well. And her life felt like she too was imprisoned in her circumstances. But God was with Joseph. Joseph gets out of prison, begins to work for Pharaoh, and becomes so successful that he rises to number 2 in the whole kingdom. And when crisis strikes the nation in the shape of a famine, it's Joseph's leadership that saves not only the Egyptian nation, but his own estranged and starving family as well. All simply because God was with Joseph. And wasn't each Sunday Judy's proof that God was with her too, she wondered? And if Joseph could come from a broken, abusive family and still be successful, well, then couldn't she? And each Sunday, this message seeped a little deeper into her bones. So she went to an alternative high school and graduated. She wrote paper after paper applying for college scholarships until she had enough money to go to a community college and then transfer to a 4-year university. She majored in business and went to work for McDonald's after she graduated. And eventually, after 2 decades, she bought into the franchise and opened her own McDonald's store. And then she opened another. And then, instead of opening a 3rd store, she founded an organization that helps the local food bank feed children who are hungry. Judy is a modern-day Joseph, if there ever was one, and a testimony to the power of what is capable when we believe in our bones that God is with us. When I called to ask Judy her permission to tell this story, I asked her if there was anything else she wanted me to say. "Just tell them God was with me," she said. "He believed in me long before I believed in him." You see, we are not our past. We are not confined to the roles our families have assigned us. We are children of God, created in glory and beloved beyond belief, and we are free to be the people God has called and created each of us to be. I come from a deeply loving family, but a family riddled with divorce and addiction all the same. My parents are each on their 4th marriage. It's taken me 4 years, and I'm still not there every day, to realize Alyssa isn't going to leave me each time we disagree or have even a minor argument. I'm the son of an alcoholic who was himself the son of an alcoholic. My aunt was murdered in a bar, and today I get to stand up in front of all of you and preach the good news that your past and your family do not determine who you are, because God is always present, always with you to write a new story in our lives. This is the Joseph story alive today in each of us, because God is alive today in each of us. But this story isn't simply good news to us personally. It's good news to us communally. And that's a message our great big American family needs more than ever today in the week of this weekend's events. According to Fox News report, violence broke out at a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville when demonstrators from across the nation came together to protest the Charlottesville City Council's 3-2 vote to take down a Confederate general statue in a public park and sell it. David Duke, a former Grand Wizard in the Ku Klux Klan who claims to be one of the organizers, told reporters, "We're going to take our country back." And standing in front of the Confederate general statue, I suppose no one needed to ask the ex-KK leader, from whom? Many have probably seen the footage of a car speeding up and slamming into a crowd of anti-protesters, leaving many injured and at least one dead. An act that, if it had been committed by a Muslim, would likely have been called terrorism, or had the violent protest not been white, may have been called a riot by the media. And the protest was unfortunately named Unite the Right, which now challenges conservatives across the country to proclaim that the right is not united in these acts of racist violence. And as the violence escalated, the governor was forced to declare a state of emergency. a black eye. Another black eye for the American people, and yet another reminder, as if one was even needed, that racism is alive and well. This weekend, we witnessed the prejudice our black sisters and brothers have told us is there. Perhaps now we'll believe them. Perhaps now we can see for ourselves that some of the same systems of prejudice and favoritism that we see in Joseph's family can also be found passed from generation to generation in our own great big American family. Racism is America's systemic sin. And sadly, the principles of inequity were present at our very founding, allowing us to enslave an entire people group for our own socioeconomic benefit. And 100 years later, many Americans, but not all, repented of slavery and fought to end that ungodly institution. But our country didn't dig deep enough. We ended legal slavery, but not the racism from which it grew. Treating a symptom without curing the disease. That's evident enough in the Jim Crow South as systems of bigotry continued to oppress black Americans. And during the civil rights movement, some, but yet again, not all, struggled to end the laws enforcing inequality. Unfortunately, all while the vast majority of the white church in the South either watched in silence or fought for their right to be superior in the eyes of the law, just as many of our ancestors did before that when they fought for their right to own slaves. Will we believe our black brothers and sisters today when they yet again tell us that racism is still alive and well? For today, now we must work to rectify that great wrong, that has been present in our American system. And the Joseph story reminds us that God is with us when we do so. And we must join in the struggle, because this isn't just black people's problem. It's all of our problem. In Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, the story goes that while he was jailed in Birmingham, he was in a prison, a cell by himself. Then the lights were turned off. But a newspaper was smuggled into him underneath the door. And he wrote this letter addressed to white clergy on the margins of this newspaper with only the light that came in underneath the cell door. And in it, King writes, "I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." That was King's plea, or charge maybe, for white clergy and the white church to join the struggle. And now, today again, is our time to be Josephs, not just in our own families, but in our nation, and to break the cycles of injustice and bigotry that we've inherited. We didn't create these systems all by ourselves, but with God with us, surely we can leave them to our children in better shape than they were left to us. May we all have the courage to do so. Amen.